Carter has never used the word apartheid in relation to that. And of course, it's not only Jews who are upset by his use of the word apartheid. He was warned about it in advance. Congressman John Conyers, African-American congressman from Michigan, with lots of Arab constituents, condemned Carter for his use of the word apartheid, saying it diminishes the suffering that Africans suffered in South Africa when they suffered from real apartheid. What Israel is doing has nothing to do with apartheid. Carter is wrong when he says there are roads in the West Bank that are for Jews only. Wrong. There are roads for Israelis only. Israeli Christians, Israeli Arabs, Israeli Jews, because they're designed to protect against terrorism from non-Israelis. That's common in areas of occupation, and that's common in many parts of the world today. Is Israel's occupation perfect? No. Would I like to see it end? Of course I would, and I strongly oppose many elements of it. But to use the word apartheid to describe what's going on in Israel or the West Bank is just absolutely appalling. And so again, we started to do some research, and I was a friend of Jimmy Carter. This is so upsetting to me to have to do this. 1976, I'd never heard of him. I get a letter from Plains, Georgia, handwritten note, dear Mr. Dershowitz, I enjoyed your article in the New York Times the other day about sentencing reform. Could you please give me help in my upcoming campaign on other issues of criminal justice? CC Stu, and I knew who Stu was, Stuart Eisenstadt, my former student and my friend. So I went to work for the campaign, and I became one of his leading advisors on criminal justice issues. In fact, when Newsweek magazine asked his campaign who the people who we would like to appoint if he becomes president, I was on that list, and my picture was in Newsweek magazine as one of the people he wanted to appoint to a position in government. I worked closely on all his election campaigns. I supported his receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. I was with him a year ago this week in Israel at the Herzliya conference. We were both there for the election. He went to Ramallah to watch the election. I went to East Jerusalem to watch the election. And so it pains me deeply to have to expose this. And you know, once things like this happen, then begin to steamroll. We learned just the other day from Neil Scher, who was the former head of AIPAC and the former chief Nazi prosecutor in Washington, that when he was the chief Nazi prosecutor in Washington in 1987, a man named Martin Bartesch was found to be a horrible Nazi killer who had killed masses of people as a member of the Waffen-SS and one of these really horrible, paradigmatic Nazis. And the United States government went after him and was about to deport him. Neil Scher got a handwritten note from President Carter, then former President Carter. Could he, quote, give special consideration to this Nazi war criminal and see if there's anything he could do to allow him to stay in the country? How many times has Jimmy Carter asked for special consideration for other people on humanitarian grounds? And then when the first Holocaust Museum was built in Washington, the first chairman of the Holocaust Council was a man named Monroe Friedman, and Monroe Friedman provided a list of people for the Holocaust Council. Jimmy Carter sent it back, he was then president, with a handwritten note, too many Jews. He wanted to reduce the number of Jews on the Holocaust Council. This is a man with a Jewish problem. This is a man who, his issues go deeper than just this book. And it's a tragedy that a man who has done so many good things in his life has had to end his legacy in this way. I have now concluded that Jimmy Carter has the lowest ratio of real to apparent integrity of any man in American public life. His apparent integrity is very, very high, but his real integrity is quite low. And the way in which he has received so much funding from Arab sources, and without disclosing it. And by the way, we've now made a request to have him disclose the Arab funding prior to 2000, because the IRS forms only go back a certain number of years. And so far, they've refused to make that disclosure, but we will persist. And we will ask him, or we'll have students ask him, what is he hiding? Why is he refusing to make disclosure of prior Arab contributions, and how much has he received, and what proportion of the funding of the Carter Center has come from Arab money? So these are issues that I think have to be debated and have to be brought out into the public light. We live in very, very difficult and dangerous times. We live in the best of times. We are the most affluent, successful, influential Jewish community in the world, maybe the second most. I remember, again, the portion of the week this week starts with the story of how Joseph had been so influential in Egypt, and suddenly a new Pharaoh came, and the new Pharaoh remembered not the Jews and looked around and saw that they were too powerful and too influential, and he decided to do something about that. We're living through those times today. But we're living through extremely dangerous times. The risks posed to Israel today are greater than at any time before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. This is the first time Israel faces an existential threat, and it's lost its confidence in some ways. Yesterday, the chief of the IDF was forced to resign. The Prime Minister of Israel is now being investigated. Every Prime Minister of Israel is always being investigated. I know because I get the phone calls usually. And the Israeli government is very scrupulous about corruption. They have much tougher laws than the United States does. They have a law which is called Shlach et halechem, send the bread on the water law, which means you are prohibited from doing favors for people in government even without quid pro quos. The concept is if you give people some favor, maybe at some point later on in life they will return the favor. If that were the law in America, 535 of the 535 members of Congress would currently be in jail. We have a different rule. We have a quid pro quo rule, but the Israeli government today is in a state of lack of confidence. There's no obvious bold leader emerging since the illness of Prime Minister Sharon and the death of former Prime Minister Rabin. It's been a very, very difficult time for Israel, and the war in Lebanon did not go as well as it could have, and it didn't go as well as it could have for a very, very simple reason, and this is also very relevant. Hamas and Hezbollah have figured out a way of exploiting the morality of Israel, much the way the Shias and Sunnis in Iraq have figured out a way of exploiting the morality of the United States. What they do is this. They hide behind civilians. They then use them as shields, and they send rockets and terrorists to kill innocent Israelis, and then put to Israel a choice. The choice is a very simple one. Either do nothing, in which case we'll continue to embolden ourselves and send rockets to kill your people, or come and attack us. And if you do, you will kill civilians, because we've arranged for that. We've made sure that we hide among civilians. And that's the plan. That's the idea. The day that Israel sent that rocket into Qana and killed 26 people was Hezbollah's best day of the war. They celebrated. They wanted Israel to kill Lebanese civilians. That's why they didn't build bomb shelters. Israel built bomb shelters. Hezbollah knew what was going to happen. They deliberately didn't build bomb shelters. They deliberately stopped southern Lebanese from leaving and going north because they wanted civilian casualties. A Western diplomat from Europe said recently that the terrorists have figured out the cruel arithmetic of death. When they kill an Israeli civilian or an American, they win. When Israel or the United States retaliates and accidentally kills a civilian, they win, because that's what they want to do, and they play into the hands of the media and human rights organizations. I spoke this morning to the editorial board of the Houston Chronicle, and I made this point to them, and the editorial director was very interested, and he asked me to write an op-ed piece about this new way of fighting wars by taking advantage of the higher morality of the democracies. Israel could have easily destroyed all of Hezbollah if they just adopted the policy that Russia adopts in Chechnya, carpet bombing. You just destroy everything in sight. It would have been very, very simple. Israel won't do that. Israel can deter suicide bombers. Not easy to deter a suicide bomber who wants to die, who wants to go to paradise and get his 72 virgins. Obviously, if you can persuade him, you don't get 72 virgins. It's a misreading of the text. All you get is one 72-year-old virgin, maybe. But that's not going to happen. But there is another way. There is another way of deterring suicide bombers. The Soviets figured it out in the 1980s. What they did when terrorists, who were suicide terrorists, went and captured some Soviet diplomats, the KGB simply came in and murdered all the relatives of the terrorists. It's called Zipanov. It was invented by the Germans and the Nazis during the Holocaust. It started with liturgy, obviously. When a German was killed, the German government came in and killed all the men of liturgy, and that was Zipanov. Kill relatives, kill friends. We can't do that. We're moral people. Israel can't do that. The United States can't do that. Jews can't do that. Decent Christians and Muslims can't do that. You can't kill innocent relatives. So you can't deter. And this method of fighting a war against non-deterrable people who are willing to give up their civilians, who are willing to have civilians killed, poses a new dilemma of warfare. It could not succeed, however, without the media. It could not succeed without Human Rights Watch. I used to be an active member of Human Rights Watch. I am no longer associated with that organization. During the war, they issued statement after statement saying not a single civilian, not a single Hezbollah fighter hit among civilians. Then when they saw the videotapes, which Israel produced, showing it over and over and over again, rockets coming from civilian areas, they didn't even apologize. You can still find their original statement online saying that Israel retaliated against civilians deliberately and willfully. Hezbollah can't fight that kind of fight unless it knows it will get media support, unless it knows it will get support of human rights organizations, unless it knows it will get the support of the United Nations. And the reason Israel lost to the extent it did the war in Lebanon, or didn't win as much as it could have won, it's because its higher morality constrained it from lowering itself to the position of its enemies. And the enemies know that, and they exploit that morality. And they exploit the concept of cleanliness of arms, of holiness of arms that Israel has. I'll tell you another story about that I'm surprised hasn't been more widely publicized. It was told to me by a young man whose father is a friend of mine who served in the IDF. He belonged to a group that went into mosques and other places looking for weapons that were being stored. And in some of the places they would have tripwires. Then the bombs would go off and injure or kill soldiers. And so the Israeli army had trained dogs to go in and sniff for the explosives. And they were about to send a dog into a mosque, which they had reason to believe had explosives. And the captain in charge of the unit said, no, 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 we can't do that. A dog is an unholy animal to Muslims, and to send a dog into a mosque would be to desecrate the mosque, much like, you know, the Syrians, the Greeks, desecrated Israeli mosques, Israeli temple during the story of Hanukkah. So they decided not to do it. It has a happy ending. Nobody was killed and nobody was hurt. But they did find the weapons. But can you imagine if it had ended in tragedy, being the captain who had to call the relatives of the Israeli soldier who was killed, saying, your son died because we wouldn't send a dog into a mosque because it would create an unholiness in the mosque? When a mosque is used to store weapons, it ceases to be a mosque. It ceases to become a religious place. It becomes a legitimate military target. But these are the kinds of issues that Israel is facing. These are the kinds of moral issues that the United States is facing. These are the kinds of issues that the Holocaust Museum is teaching so effectively about: how to make difficult moral choices, how to make sure that nothing is ever done without consideration of morality. When I was in Israel last, just about a year ago this time, I was taken by the Israeli Air Force. In fact, it was Dershowitz, who was the man who left the Air Force, became the head of the IDF and now resigned, and Shkedi, who is now the head of the Air Force, allowed me to come and watch a committee in operation that was the committee that had the power to decide when targeted killing should be permitted and should not be permitted. Targeted killings, of course, are directed against terrorists who are engaged in ongoing terrorism, and they are selected for attack to prevent terrorist attacks from occurring. There are two kinds. One, there are people who are in the midst of doing an attack. That would be preemption. Nobody claims there's anything wrong with that, except if you kill people disproportionately to the numbers. And the second are more preventive, when you have commanders or heads or planners. And so this committee, which consists of a professor of philosophy of Tel Aviv University, a very prominent professor of philosophy, a professor of human rights, a woman from Bar Ilan University, a mathematician, a Bayesian mathematician who does the probability analysis, and a group of other people, some in the Army, some outside the Army, about 10 of them. And they sit around and debate whether or not, in a particular case, the costs and benefits, the morality justifies the use of a targeted killing. For example, in one case that I heard debated, one of the leading terrorists who was planning massive terrorist attacks, which eventually occurred in the city of Ashkelon, where they tried to blow up the oil tanks, was targeted. But he always had his wife with him. And his wife was a collaborator, but she was not somebody involved in terrorism. And the decision that had to be made by the committee Is it okay to target him and kill him in the presence of his wife if that's the only way to get him? Because he was using his wife essentially as a human shield. And the decision was made no, not to do it, to wait until you got him alone, and they never were able to get him alone. There were other issues as well that were debated. At one point, the debate occurred. These are the kinds of ethical debates that I can imagine occurring at an academic setting in the Holocaust Center. There was a terrorist that had to be neutralized, and there were two ways of going after him. One, to send in Israeli soldiers in the middle of Gaza City, this was before the occupation ended, risking the lives of 6 to 8 Israeli soldiers, or sending in a bomb, risking the lives of 6 to 8 Palestinian civilians. And the professor at Tel Aviv, who was the philosopher, said he would think that it would be justified to send in the bomb because any country has the right to prefer its own soldiers' lives over the lives of enemy non-combatants. And the head of the Air Force banged his hand on the table and said, no, that's not the way we do it in Israel. Soldiers' lives must be put at risk before we put the risks of enemy civilians at risk. And these are the kinds of decisions that get made every day in Israel. These are the kinds of balanced judgments that democracies make. Can you imagine a debate like that going on in Hamas? Or a debate like that going on in Hezbollah? A debate like that even going on in France? I find that very difficult to imagine. And yet France sits in judgment over Israel all the time. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. Today, Israel, the Jewish community, Holocaust survivors have the high road. But the high road is being taken away from us very quickly. You have people like Norman Finkelstein, who claims to be the children of survivors, but denies that other survivors are real survivors. And he writes books claiming that the Holocaust is being used to justify Israeli aggression. And he makes claims about the Jewish community in America and all of those things. And he's about to get tenure at a major university, the largest Catholic university in America, DePaul University, is about to give this Holocaust minimizer, this Holocaust justice denier, the man who says that Elie Wiesel made up his life, tenure. And when he gets tenure, he will be using his tenure to propagandize students in his classes and students around the country, because he's a very popular speaker on the hard left. And this campaign to try to change the minds of American young people, a campaign which Jimmy Carter has now become part of. By the way, the ADL has now documented the uses to which Carter's book have been put on hate sites all over the world. Neo-Nazi hate sites, Holocaust denial hate sites, anti-Israel Islamic radical hate sites. Carter will say, it's not my fault, I didn't put it on those hate sites. But he's an intelligent man. He had to know that the kinds of arguments he's making were going to be picked up by these hate sites and by young people in colleges and universities. And what's going on today in colleges and universities is there's an attempt to turn today's students, who are tomorrow's leaders, tomorrow's Barack Obamas are my students today. Barack Obama, when I think about who my students are, my former students are Barack Obama and Elliot Spitzer and the people who are today dominating in American politics. And so my current students are tomorrow's leaders. And these current students are being propagandized by teachers in colleges, starting in high schools, and colleges and professional schools. And the goal is to create a generation of future leaders 20 years from now, which will have the same knee-jerk opposition to Israel that French leaders have today, and some German leaders have today. Germany has been generally quite good, but there are some German leaders on the hard left today who don't have that attitude, and some British leaders on the hard left today. And it's hard to get a fair hearing in some parts of Europe today for Israel's case. It's not hard to get a fair hearing in the United States. But the goal of this campaign, and it's a well-financed campaign, Arab money is being directed at universities, not at political figures. The Arab money has made a decision. It's not a matter of Jewish money dominates over Arab money. You know, when the Gulf states lobby or the Saudi oil lobby is in conflict with the Israeli lobby, the oil lobby wins most of the time. Remember the AWAC dispute that occurred when the United States was going to sell AWACs to Saudi Arabia? The Israeli lobby lost. The Israeli lobby loses often when oil money is on the other side. It's that Arab money has been purposely filtered away from political campaigns, because that's the past, to young people on college campuses, because that's the future. If you look at many university programs today in the Middle East, they are funded by Saudi money. and he who pays the piper does call the tune. Columbia University today is very, very hard for students to get a fair shake on the Middle East. The positions espoused by professors are so biased and so one-sided. Jimmy Carter doesn't mention that in his book. He never once looks at university campuses and sees whether or not there's a fair balance. All he says is the Palestinians can't get a fair presentation in Congress or in the American media, never looking at the American Academy. And so the Holocaust Museum, particularly what you have here, and I just admire it so much. In Boston, we don't have something like this. We just have a memorial. It's a nice memorial, and it's very interesting to see, but it's there. It's just there. Here what you have is something that uses the past to teach about the present and the future, and you do it so well. It's done without a heavy hand. It's done not in an effort to propagandize. It's done in an effort to let the viewer and the student make the aha connection, make the connection himself or herself, and see the connection between the past and the present, and make us understand that none of us can ever again be a bystander. There was a wonderful statement in the back of the pamphlet, the membership pamphlet, by a 6th grade student, Mike Moses, who says, "I will not be a bystander if something as painful as the Holocaust were ever to happen again." And that's so important. My former student, Samantha Powers, who I know was here and spoke here, was inspired by the lessons of the Holocaust and devotes her life to making sure that it can never happen again. And whenever she comes back from one of her trips somewhere in the world, I always have dinner with her, and it's always so frustrating because she says the same thing over and over again. No one cares. No one is doing anything. You can't get people involved. You can't get people interested. You'd think when you see these terrible stories and these terrible images and these terrible pictures, people would wake from their lethargy. But the same story persists. But you're doing a great job in this museum to make sure that students have their consciences touched, that they see and that they understand that all it takes for evil to succeed is for a few good men and women to do nothing. That's the lesson of the Holocaust, and that's the lesson that we cannot permit to ever again become the state of lethargy to which it's so easy to fall into. And so I want to have a conversation with you about this during our remaining time, and I want to make the transition by telling you my favorite story from the Talmud. My favorite story from the Talmud is about Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was a kind of cantankerous but brilliant decisor of Jewish law, and he was teaching a course on the property law, halacha of property. And the question came up, who owns a valuable bird found outside of someone's home? Rabbi Eliezer says the halacha is if the bird is found more than 40 yards from the house, it belongs to the person who finds it. But if it's found within 40 yards or amot from the house, it belongs to the person in front of whose house it was found. The student, Jeremiah, raises his hand and says, but Rabbi, what if 1 foot of the bird is outside of 40 amot and 1 foot of the bird is inside of 40 amot? And the Talmud says, for asking that kind of question, the student Yirmiyahu was thrown out of the yeshiva. Why do I love that story? Because I went to yeshiva up through 12th grade, and I would always ask those kinds of questions. Line drawing questions. I always wanted to know what side of the line the law was on. And my rebbes would throw me out too, saying it's a klutz kasha. It's only a question that a klutz would ask. In fact, my rebbes always had the most wonderful put down. The rebbe would say, Dershowitz, if your question is such a smart one, then the rabbis who were so much smarter than you would have thought of it first. If the rabbis who were so much smarter than you didn't think of it first, then it's not such a good question. I was not a good student in high school and elementary school. In fact, my teacher called me in one day and said, Dershowitz, you got a good mouth on you, but a Yiddish cup, a Jewish brain you don't have. Carter agrees. So in fact, my yearbook had a wonderful phrase. It says, Alan Dershowitz, a mouth of Webster and a head of clay. Very cute. My mother came in and made him change it. But so he calls me in and he says, Dershowitz, I need to figure out a profession for you that you can use your mouth but not your head. And he said, remember this is an Orthodox rabbi, he said, I have two ideas for you. One, he said, you could become a lawyer, or two, you could become a conservative rabbi. Because that was the biggest insult he can come up with. He couldn't even pronounce the word reform. And so I wasn't smart enough to become a rabbi, and so I had to become a lawyer. Now, I just finished last year my 42nd year of teaching at Harvard Law School. I've had some of you as my students, and I'm always proud to see my students out there. And in 42 years, if I've learned one thing, it's that everything has one foot of the bird on one side of the line and one foot of the bird on the other. There are no easy, uncomplicated questions. I just wish the debate over the Middle East and the debate over morality understood the nuances of these issues instead of being a screaming match between people on both sides. And so, with a promise from me that no matter what questions you ask, nobody will be thrown out of this yeshiva. I welcome your questions on any topic. Thank you all very much.